Hi listeners, I'm Izzy, my pronouns are they and them. Welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. This is Joella.
Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the country that we're recording this episode on today and pay our respects to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples and their elders, past, present and emerging, by committing to always remembering that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. My name is Angela and I'll be having a conversation today with Shane Warren, who is a social work lecturer from QT. First, I would just like to acknowledge the First Nations people of the land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I am on Yagara and Turrbal land and I pay my respect to past, present and emerging elders and leaders. So today with me I have Shane. Welcome to the podcast, Shane.
Thank you, Angela. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. How are you doing today?
Oh, look, not too bad, thanks. Over here on the south side of Brisbane, and the weather's pretty gloomy outside, so wondering if it's going to start pouring down rain any moment now. But we're really glad to be here this morning with you and being involved in these really important conversations.
We're so happy to have you here, Shane. And we were just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about yourself so that we can get to know you a bit more.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I'm actually very much an introvert. So, the challenge of sharing about yourself is always a challenge for me, but I think I'm probably getting better at it as I get older. So look, just a little bit about myself. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and I'm a qualified social worker. Now I come from North Queensland, grew up in a country town in North Queensland, and from there finished my schooling. And from a working class family background, I went and studied social work at James Cook University in the early 1990s and really never looked back. I had no clear conception of what social work was when I filled out my QTAC form almost 30 years ago now. It'll be 30 years next year. But I have to say, I really made the absolute best decision because as I've grown older and the more I've got to understand and learn and practice social work, found that it's something that's been really consistent with my own values base. And I just sort of think, in terms of my own personal and professional development now, thinking over 30 years, social work has offered so much to my life. I'm incredibly grateful and also really excited at this point in my life. I'm 46 years old and I'll be just finishing 2 years of teaching social work now at QUT. And prior to that, had worked for about 22 years in different areas of social work. I worked in disability services in Rockhampton. I worked in family support areas for families with children and adults with disability and children also on the cusp of coming into child protection. I also worked for 2 years in frontline child protection social work in England. That was really challenging, working with police in and out of the courts. And after about 11 years or so of doing all of that sort of work, I managed to secure a job with the Queensland Government Homelessness program area, policy and program area. And that was just a wonderful opportunity for me when I look back on it. I came in right into the beginning of, in 2000, at the end of 2008 was when I started that job. And it coincided with a moment where there was a national white paper on homelessness that Kevin Rudd had just released and a big injection of funding from government that allowed a whole lot of new contemporary approaches to ending homelessness for different community members. And it was a really exciting time to be a part of. And there was so much hope and optimism at that time. And it was a great opportunity for me to come and learn. And so I guess in saying that, my career has encompassed direct practice and service delivery, but also policy and program work, and in the trials and tribulations of that, seen many ministers over the years, different colours of government, all bringing with them their their challenges to issues. But I think, our opportunity to influence and advocate and also engage in activism is just so crucial to social work. And now I've got this opportunity over the last 2 years to be able to share sort of knowledge and experience and really support students as much as I'm able to. And I'm really quite excited to have this opportunity.
Wow. Sounds like you have a lot of experience in the field. And yeah, that's so great to hear everything that you've been able to gain in your practice. It must be a very valuable experience for you. So I was wondering if we could just dive straight into the pedagogy that you use. So yeah, can you tell me about the pedagogy that you work from?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Angela. It's a really good question. In terms of my sort of pedagogies informing my practice frameworks and approaches, they're very much based in the critical social work traditions, and specifically anti-oppressive practices are extremely important to me. And thinking critically about the power that social workers have, and especially within their agency and organisational systems and contexts, mindfulness around that power and how it manifests in our relationships with clients, extremely important. There's a lot I could say about that in the different contexts I've worked. I've worked with some of the most marginalised, some of the most vulnerable people, in the child protection systems, people experiencing poverty, people experiencing homelessness, people experiencing domestic and family violence, people engaging with the youth justice or criminal justice systems. So those anti-oppressive practices are really important in terms of our foundations as critical social workers and conceptualizations around power and what that constructions of power and just how important that is. And I'll just go one step further there. When I was studying social work in the early 1990s, critical social work was just really beginning to be talked about. There had been quite a tradition of radical social work, and radical social work really meant Marxist social work or feminist social work. And it was often pioneered by a lot of academics from the United Kingdom. And, Mike Brake was one of those original radical social workers. And I've always sort of held on, one of his teachings was around, as social workers, we have a lot of power and positional power. And like when we're in those situations of working with the most marginalised and vulnerable people in our society, where do we put the pressure? Do we put the pressure onto service users and clients who are already extremely vulnerable and marginalised? Or do we put that pressure upwards into the organisations and in the authority structures in which we work and practice? And I've really held on to that because I think it goes to the point that we're able to influence and we're able to sort of advocate upwards around resources. Are we part of social change? And I believe that social work is fundamentally about social change. Or if we're about imposing from that top-down sort of authority structure, is it about social control? And I think we really need to resist and reject any constructions of social work practice that's about social control.
I agree. Yeah.
Just a few other things I would say there. So I've talked about anti-oppressive practice. I'm a pro-feminist gay male, and I think that's a really important tradition for me to be an ally and a supporter of, thinking about fundamental inequalities throughout our society on the basis of gender.
Yeah.
And worked, as I was saying, in the fields of homelessness and gender-based violence. And, you see that really played out in those particular areas, and thinking critically again about social policy in these spaces, whose voices are being heard, who's being privileged, and whose voices are being excluded. So I'm very proud pro-feminist. But also anti-racist practice is important to me. I'm a white middle-class male these days, an older male, and I recognise that by virtue of that, there's a whole lot of benefits I've been afforded right throughout my life. Recognise the original dispossession of First Nations peoples, that everyone in Australia, we all derive benefits from that, those processes of dispossession and colonisation of our First Nations peoples here. So keeping that sort of central is really important to me as well. Just moving on to critical pedagogy a bit more. So I guess in more recent years too, thinking critically about what that means in social work education. And I guess really sort of got back into Paolo Freire's work in recent times around deconstructing and critiquing the banking concept of education, and very passionate about that idea in the context of social work education, that as much as possible that we should be engaging with communities in which we work. I really think, social work education is at its best when we're undertaking that learning as part of communities. So breaking down some of those oppressive structures that occur within, especially higher education systems, that prevent people from being able to do that. So the idea of thinking critically about social education and where we are now in the 2020s. And, I'm really grateful to be here at QUT because I know QUT takes this issue really seriously.
Yeah. It sounds like advocacy is an underlying theme there, Shane, and everything that, you've talked about. You really talked about how, you want to uphold people that are being marginalized. And I think that's really great. It sounds like you have a wealth of knowledge, and I really like the way that you have been practicing. And I guess, has it always been this way for you in your practice, or what brought you to be interested in this pedagogy? Is this a pedagogy that you've always worked from, or is this something that you've started more recently?
I think it's something that's developed and grown stronger as of, and certainly, Angela, to be upfront, I'm 46, but if you were to interview me 20 years ago, some of my responses to some of these questions would be a bit different. And I think that's the wonderful thing about our pedagogies and practice frameworks, is that they're never static. They're always developing, and we're challenging ourselves and thinking critically about a whole range of areas. So, my practice framework has developed and grown, but I think my commitments around critical social work have got stronger as I've got older, because I've recognised just the growing inequalities throughout the world. So, we've seen over the last 40 years, a whole range of social and economic inequality, and that having really big impacts, for the most marginalised in our community. And I've really put a lot of effort into trying to follow and critique some of these trends and processes that have happened in society. And things, when I was coming through university, there were the debates about, GST, for instance. GST, a really regressive form of tax, and people that I knew and got involved, we all reacted to it very strongly. And anyway, GST eventually came in under John Howard, and we've seen it as this regressive form of tax on people. But then, we've seen income taxes and corporate taxes decrease. And if you look at the evidence around that, it's really striking that middle class and businesses, the amount of tax breaks and tax concessions and tax write-offs, and what would be called, Lois Bryson would refer to it as fiscal welfare, that has really increased over the last 30 or 40 years. And, it's really at the heart of a lot of the structural inequality. So I just gave that example around the GST, but there's many other examples of it as well. And in more recent times, I'm very critical of the government's home builder scheme. I think billions of dollars of taxpayer money going towards private home ownership, and people making very expensive home renovations that only favours the very wealthy end of our society.
Yeah,
that's another example of something that I find just atrocious. I find there's a range of other examples as well. With Job Seeker, I understand now it's something like 32 or $38 billion of taxpayers' money has gone to companies that made huge profits during the pandemic. And the government's got no desire to pursue those companies paying that money back. And I just think while we have decisions like that being made, it means there's less money being spent on affordable childcare and quality childcare. There's less money being spent on housing, less money going into education systems. And this is all the product of, really strong neoliberalist policy settings. And as I said, stuff that's been really sort of happening now for the best part of of 40 years. And I really hope people right across the world are sort of waking up to some of that.
Yeah. So it sounds a lot like the more that you practice, the more you're kind of exposed to these issues, and the more your practice framework has developed as the years go on. It's more of like a constant evolution of, not evolution, like evolving, your practice is evolving as the years go on.
That's right. And social work is fundamentally a political activity. We've got a value base that's very strongly committed to social justice and environmental justice. And it does mean that we're critiquing the way resources are allocated and distributed within society, and that we're locating those personal issues that people are experiencing broadly within some of those structural contexts, whether that's the economy, whether it's the way agencies or service systems are structured or resourced. That famous feminist saying from the 1970s holds true: the personal is political.
Yeah, that's a good quote. Shane, I was wondering, how has your practice influenced you when you're working with people who are homeless?
Yeah, and that's another really good question as well. So, and it's something that I do think about a lot. I've had experiences at a personal level, and I've known people in my family that have experienced homelessness. I also know people in my community that have experienced homelessness. I've also, as a social work practitioner, had experiences there, and also in policy debates and contexts. So there's been a range of different experiences that inform my perspective on this. And, I think one of the things I would say is that I've really noticed that our society is extremely judgmental of people experiencing homelessness. And social workers, we need to be able to reject that stereotyping and the discrimination that happens, and the judgmental practices that I see happen. I think there's a whole lot of judgments and labels given towards people experiencing homelessness. And I think, as one of my former ministers said once, there's not much you can do. And if you don't have a stable roof over your head, there's not much else you can do in life. You can't go on and you can't hold down a job. You can't get into or engage with education, if you're sleeping on the street or you're in emergency shelters or couch surfing. You can't really focus on your health issues if your housing's not there. So housing is one of those really fundamental platforms. I mean, it fits with, I guess, old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that if we don't have that sort of basic structure in our lives, it's very hard to go on and achieve other goals that we may have. So I guess, in my observations, I've seen a lot of judgmental practice, people saying, people being labelled as drug addicts, or they can't manage their money, or they waste their money, or they're gambling. A lot of it is the discourses around demonising the poor. Yeah. And I think social workers, it's really important for us to be sort of rejecting those discourses and, and especially, when people present to services seeking housing assistance or other sorts of support, that we really do listen and we're present and recognise that without having, if these people have been sleeping rough for so long, all that comes along with that, or had no stable accommodation, been victims of violence, got no money, that has a major, major impact on people's lives. And just think, there's one thing I'd like people to take out of this podcast is, please reject any of the dominant sort of labelling and stereotyping and judgments that get made of people experiencing homelessness. I'd really encourage people to do that. So I've talked a bit about that in terms of other parts of practice. I mean, I think that we've also got to think critically about social policy here as well, haven't we? I said earlier in this podcast, our federal government that's completely absent has not committed $1 to affordable housing. And also, I mentioned earlier that, in 2008, just after Kevin Rudd got elected, there was a white paper on homelessness, and, there was an injection of funding then, but there hasn't been at a federal level since that time. We've had 8 years of Conservative government. Australia's population has grown. We've been through pandemic. We've had all sorts of other issues around poverty, violence, and other inequality. but there's been no substantial increase in funding for homelessness services either. And I just think that is absolutely appalling. And I think we need to keep telling the story, because I don't think people realise out there just the pressures that social workers and social welfare agencies are under.
And Shane, what would you say to people who might say that people being homeless is an account of their own self? Because I think that's like one of the stereotypes that I hear. Like when I talk about it with peers, they'll say, oh, they got themselves into that situation and like no consideration for other factors. But I guess, what would you say to people who probably think that way or have that judgment toward people who are homeless?
Look, that's a really good question. And that really ties in with what I was trying to talk about before, about judgments. And that is a really common judgment that happens. And I think we need to utterly reject it. That, we live in a society where there's fundamentally shortage of affordable and appropriate housing. We've got massive issues around inequality. And in terms of my own research, I've interviewed rough sleepers. And, I remember in part of my PhD, this was in Mackay, and interviewed a young man. He'd become homeless at 15 and he was sort of couch surfing at that time. And couch surfing went on for about 18 months. And then he became sleeping on the street, and then he was in and out of shelters, emergency shelter, back on the street. And he was about 21 or so when I interviewed him. And his advice to me was, I've slept on the riverbanks, been bashed so many times from all sorts of people. The little possessions I have get stolen every 2 to 3 days. And what little money I have to support is like a cycle. I'm constantly using what little money I have to replenish things that get stolen. And, things like youth, this young fellow was on youth allowance, which is something like $220 a fortnight. So that's like $110 a week.
Yeah.
And even some of the homeless services charge fees for people to stay there. And this young man's advice back to me, in light of all of those things, what person actually makes a choice to do that? What person makes a conscious decision? Yes, I'm going to be bashed up all the time, constantly have no money, constantly have my few personal items stolen, be attacked, all of these things. And I think we do need to be really mindful of this stereotype and judgment stuff that happens around our homelessness as an individual choice. Because the other thing that we don't sort of realize is often there's a whole lot of history too, of trauma. People have had family breakdowns. There's been abuse within families. There's been mental health issues that people haven't had the access to the right sort of supports that they need. There's a whole range of factors that contribute to this. And the whole discourse of homelessness is an individual choice, it gets me really worked up. And it's such an unhelpful, and it's often perpetuated too by white middle-class people that are in very good jobs and wouldn't really know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. And so Shane, what have you found the most challenging when working from your approach and your practice framework in the housing and homelessness area?
Yeah, so that's a really good question as well. Now, look, I'm a big advocate the housing and homelessness sector and the related sectors of domestic and family violence and youth. Very passionate about those sectors, and I want to really recognise the strains that have been put under by neoliberal sort of policy settings. That's probably one of the things, and the expectations that governments and communities have of those organisations, and just the incredible work that they do, the absolutely incredible work that they do.
And Shane, what do you mean by, I guess, neoliberal discourses? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So with neoliberal discourses, that means a range of things. If we're talking about initiatives that are more about, generating profit to start with, as opposed to achieving social justice goals, the managerialism and the business kind of ethics overriding social work or social justice ethics.
Right.
That's probably my first comment there. It also reflects in the way governments fund organisations. It's reflected in the sorts of rhetoric that you see in government policy.
Yeah.
homelessness is a very complex area as well, and really important not to think about it homogeneously. So there's many different types of homelessness. People sleeping rough is what everyone thinks of, but it includes couch surfing. It includes people in severely overcrowded housing. It includes people in emergency shelters. It includes people in boarding houses. So there's a whole range of different scenarios there that it includes. And it is important, and I say that so that people get a firm understanding that it's not just about rough sleepers or visible homelessness. But going back to your question around neoliberalism, I think governments increasingly are output and outcome funded. And I think they try and sort of reduce this really sort of complex area down to some really arbitrary sort of measures around numbers of clients that a service sees or hours of service delivery, which is not particularly useful or meaningful. I think that, in terms of neoliberalism as well, that it's that classic hostility to the social welfare system. So the idea that governments should have a very minimal role, in relation to the provision of social welfare. It's a very minimalist sort of system, and, people need to be responsible for their own lives, and there shouldn't be sort of greater investment in social welfare. And I just think, for me, this is the problem. We need a much bigger investment in social welfare, and we need to be sort of recognising the great work that homelessness agencies do and the creative work that they do.
And Shane, do you think much has changed in the last 20 years in terms of investment into the welfare system? Like, do you think it's got better or maybe not better?
Yeah. Well, I actually think it's got worse. So the homelessness area, as I said before, under the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, there hasn't been any increase in federal funding to homelessness in over a decade. Now, that is embarrassing and shameful to Australia. It really is. If you look in other areas, mental health, I think, probably has had a little bit more funding gone into that area, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And if you look at domestic and family violence, we are way behind where we need to be there. Well and truly a long, long way behind. And our society is only just starting to, I think, realise the pandemic of violence against women that we have. So that's another area that I think that's been chronically underfunded. Things like the NDIA, sure, there may have been some extra funding, but is it actually going to the people that really need those supports? And is it the supports that they really need, or is it, again, managerialist kind of service providers determining those needs for people? So, yeah, and look, I have to admit I haven't been working in the disability field for some time, but yeah, that's one that I'm watching sort of critically. But look, if we're having royal commissions into disability, we're having royal commissions into aged care, I think that's also telling us there's chronic problems associated with those systems. I'm also very critical of the federal government at the moment rolling out the cashless debit card, increasing the number of locations now. Now, that is a punitive measure that will further stigmatise the most marginal people in our society. I think we all have a role to play in rejecting it. And the other thing I would say about this is, if anyone has had experience working with someone with an alcohol or drug issue, just how difficult it is to locate a very basic counselling service even to assist that person. I certainly have been down that path many times for people that I've worked with and know it. It is so hard. It is. So on the one hand, we have this government increasing the punitive nature of social welfare through cashless, but, they're not investing in all the other things: housing, greater and better alcohol and drug services, support services for people that have been victims of violence. These are the things that I'm really critical about.
And are these the things that you probably find most challenging, I guess, about working in this area?
Look, they are, but I guess my view is that every day we've got an opportunity to influence and advocate and use our activists' approaches. And especially when we're working in organisations or government departments, there's a whole code of conduct and ethics there that we have to be sort of cognizant of. And there's scope for us to be doing critical social work in all of these areas. And I know social workers who do and do a terrific job. I was at a QCOS conference in 2016. I'll share this story quickly. And it was about 6 months before Trump got elected. This was at Brisbane, and QCOS had invited a man from the United States, Michael Caffey, who had worked under Barack Obama's Promised Neighborhoods program. So this Promised Neighborhoods program was, in really the poorest areas of Chicago, trying to get the basics right around better housing, better access to early childcare, early childhood education, parenting support, these really basic services. And he was driving this sort of policy work that Obama had really sort of led. And someone in the audience sort of said, "Oh, what's going to happen if Donald Trump gets elected?" And then most people in the audience just went, "Oh, how could you ask that question? That's not going to happen." And it did. 6 months later, it did happen. But Michael Caffey said, look, the processes of social change continue. Sometimes some of the biggest wins in terms of social change happen times where there's been the most hostile governments towards social welfare. And he pointed to a few examples of how the homelessness sector in the United States had been able to really advance their case during some really oppressive Republican regimes, that were really hostile to social welfare spending. So, and he finished this story by saying, he'll dance with whoever's in power. And by using that to dance, it means like every day we're taking our values and our code of conduct as social workers seriously, and we're using that opportunity to influence people. And that's influencing people in the meetings that we attend, the perspectives we bring to those meetings, and the critical questions about why is it that we've got this plan the way it is? Why has this policy been silent on early intervention? Where is the spending on women experiencing violence here? Those are critical questions, and we can be using our capacity to ask those critical questions here. And whether it's writing letters, or whatever it is, there's many different ways that we can be using our influence every day towards the pursuit of these goals and objectives.
Yeah, that's so true. It doesn't really the people in power, we still have our own power that we can bring to this area, and we still have the ability to advocate and bring our own values and critically question things.
That's it.
Thank you so much for all the knowledge that you've brought to this podcast. I've really learnt a lot from talking to you. But is there any final thing? I feel like we ended that last question really well. But is there any final thing you might want to add, or any words of wisdom?
Look, I think I've probably sort of covered it all. It's an ongoing process, and we pick ourselves up every day, and we keep going. And the final thing I would say is that I'm a big believer in practitioner and peer support, and social workers really collectively supporting each other. The availability of that to me in my career has kept me in social work all these years. If I didn't have supportive colleagues and other social workers in the community, that we all collectively supported each other around our work and our practice, I'm not sure I'd be here having this conversation with you now. So I'm a big believer in practitioner and peer support. I'm hoping that can see more of that happen in the years ahead as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shane, for everything that you've shared with us today. It was great having you on the podcast, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
No, it's been wonderful talking with you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Shane.
Thanks.
If you'd like to keep up with any of our socials and to continue listening to future episodes, please follow us on Instagram. That's Critical Conversations, 4SW.